Hello, and welcome to What's Happening in Myanmar, a weekly show from the Frontier Myanmar podcast family. I'm your host, Luke Corbin. This is episode 15, and today is Friday, February 14. I'm excited this morning to be joined by Sue-Lin Wong, Southeast Asia correspondent for The Economist, who recently undertook in-depth reporting on the scam industry in the region, including Myanmar. Welcome to the show, Sue-Lin.
Thanks so much for having me, Luke.
Now, before we start speaking about the scams, I'll just take 5 minutes to go over the big news for this week. Last Friday, there were talks between Othman Hashim, Special Envoy on Myanmar for the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, also known as ASEAN, and the State Administration Council in Naypyidaw. Hashim then flew to Bangkok the following day and met with representatives from the Alternative National Unity Government, the Karen National Union, and other resistance organisations. While in Naypyidaw, he apparently continued pushing for the tepid ASEAN 5-point consensus agreed to by coup leader Min Aung Hlaing back in April 2021. But further details, let alone any results of the meetings, are yet to be reported. Meanwhile, BBC Burmese reports that Thaksin Shinawatra, former Prime Minister of Thailand and father of the current Prime Minister, has also requested a sit-down with Min Aung Hlaing. He did so after meeting with Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, who he advises on ASEAN matters, on February 2nd. Independent observers have long been unimpressed with ASEAN's lacklustre attempts to influence the military regime in Myanmar. Any change there remains to be seen. While ASEAN toils in its own way to resolve the crisis in Myanmar, the new administration of the United States continues to dismantle assistance for Myanmar refugees, students, and now Burma's democracy movement. The administration, which is led by President Donald Trump and his ally Elon Musk, the world's richest man, now accused of breaking numerous US laws in his attempt to reshape the country, has already cancelled millions of dollars in scholarships for Myanmar students studying abroad and frozen most foreign aid. Now, grants and spending by the National Endowment for Democracy, or NED, have also been halted. Funded Myanmar organisations were informed on Wednesday that all NED grants are now suspended, and Politico reports that the endowment has been unable to withdraw any funds from the US Treasury since last Friday. The NED was established in 1983 with a mission to strengthen democratic institutions around the world through non-governmental efforts. It has long supported people fighting for democracy in Myanmar and has traditionally been a favourite of the Republican Party, which Donald Trump leads. It has also been long singled out for criticism by the Chinese Communist Party as a covert arm of US intelligence agencies seeking to destabilize foreign governments by funding human rights and pro-democracy groups. Elon Musk, a man with overwhelming business interests in China, also criticized US government-funded media organizations this week, disparaging media outlet Voice of America and media support organization Internews, which funds exile media in Myanmar. Frontier Myanmar published an editorial on Musk's intentions and the consequences of his attack on global media support on Monday, so check that out on the Frontier Myanmar website. The border guard in Bangladesh arrested 33 Rohingya, including 14 children, at a shelter in Bandarban district in Bangladesh near the Myanmar border on Saturday. The Rohingya fled fighting between the Arakan Army, AA, and the military, and paid brokers to smuggle them across the border. A further 58 Rohingya were apparently arrested under similar circumstances last month. Bangladesh's de facto leader, Muhammad Yunus, claims that approximately 100,000 Rohingya have fled to Bangladesh due to the fighting in northern Rakhine state. They've joined the approximately 1 million refugees already sheltering in Cox's Bazar. Most Rohingya have now left their homes and birthplaces in Rakhine State, but there remains a substantial population in Sittwe, Rakhine State's capital city, which the Arakan Army started attacking this week. The AA started with artillery shells and sniper fire last weekend, hitting 2 infantry bases about 16 kilometres north of the city centre, as well as a naval base near the Shui Mingan port. The military returned fire from both land and sea, restricted movement into and out of the town, and dispatched 4 boats of reinforcements from Yangon and Jiaopu. After a couple of days' break, the Arakan army then launched infantry attacks at several military bases in the outer area of the township. Sittwe is one of the few towns still controlled by the military in Rakhine State and has been converted into the new Western Regional Military Command after the fall of the previous command in An Township. Since taking over the state, the AA has waited to attack the symbolic Sittwe, focusing more on bases and roads in the mountains and forests dividing Rakhine State in the east from Magwe and Myawaddy and Bago regions. Most recently, it took out a military outpost in Jiagang village in Myawaddy upstream from the coast towards Tabang, and only about 30 kilometres as the crow flies from the Batain River. If the military command structure holds in Sittwe, then any full-scale attack would likely result in many hundreds of casualties in the town, not just of conscripted soldiers, but also displaced people sheltering there. Many residents can't flee due to being confined to camps or simply lacking the financial means. And coming to our guest interview, Thailand's block on supplying electricity, fuel, and internet to 5 locations across the Myanmar border continues to cause considerable hardship for people in Myawaddy and elsewhere. The block is part of the Thailand administration's renewed efforts, at the behest of China, to pressure cyber scams operating on the Myanmar border. Thaksin Shinawat made the link clear this week, saying, "If the scammers are booted out of the country, we will resume the supply of electricity and internet." There were also reports the Royal Thai Police has set up a committee to investigate alleged links between senior officers and the cyber scam syndicates. This seems to have rattled the Democratic Karen Benevolent Army and Kien State Border Guard Force, who both lease out land to businesses where cyber scams operate. Thailand is also mulling issuing arrest warrants for the Border Guard Force chief, Sue-Lin, a well-known figure implicated in the scams, and his associates. Chittu, who's often referred to as a warlord, said to BBC Burmese that he and his group cooperate with rescuing foreigners trafficked to the compounds and blamed bureaucratic hurdles for slowing things down. But this flurry of recent pressure has resulted in one quick release of around 260 trafficked foreigners from a compound south of Myawaddy. They were transferred to Thailand on Wednesday. However, and crucially, the militias profiting from the land they lease out to the scam syndicates have still not identified any of the criminals involved or made any genuine moves to end the scam operations, apart from issuing statements. These developments do come at the same time as Western media coverage of the scam industries increases. Just this week, the Washington Post published an editorial explaining pig butchering scams originating in Myanmar territory and suggesting that resolving conflict in Myanmar was crucial to reining in the global cyber scam industry. And The Economist released a new podcast series on the scam industry this week, thrusting it further into the spotlight. That show was reported and hosted by our very own guest, Sue-Lin Wong. So, Sue-Lin, it's really kind of you to come onto what's happening in Myanmar to talk about your deep dive into the scam centres in Myanmar so soon after releasing your podcast series, which is called Scam Inc., with a full stop, like Scam Incorporated. So, with that out of the way, could you tell us a little bit about the podcast and the results of your investigations into these international criminal enterprises?
So I moved to Southeast Asia about 2 years ago, and it became really obvious very quickly that scams was one of the biggest stories on my beat, if not the biggest story. And the more I dug, the more I realized, wow, this is a huge global story, but one that isn't getting that much coverage. So when I heard about a bank collapse in rural Kansas, of all places, and rumors that it was somehow connected to what I was seeing in Southeast Asia, I thought to myself, I've got to go investigate that. And so I showed up in this tiny town of Elkhart in southwestern Kansas with my producer. And we started asking around, why did the local bank here collapse? And how did the CEO, who was a very respected member of town, a part-time pastor, volunteered at the local high school where his 3 daughters attended, how did he fall for a scam and end up embezzling $47 million from a bank, from his bank? And that just led me off on my investigation and was the through line for Scam Inc., which is this 8-part podcast series I've just put out. And it takes me into Myanmar and the scam compounds there and the people who are trafficked there. But then it takes me to meet these rare inside voices who party with the scam bosses in Myanmar. And so we hear from this Taiwanese businessman who negotiates on behalf of governments to get people out of the scam compounds, and what it's like going to wild karaoke nights and staying at luxury hotels inside Myawaddy. And then we trace the origins of the scam industry to China and ask what are its links to the Chinese Communist Party, which takes me to the Philippines. And there's this crazy story of a small town mayor in the Philippines who turns out to be running a massive scam complex in her tiny town of Bamban. And then I try and follow the money. So where do the hundreds of billions of US dollars that are scammed every year actually end up? And the answer is surprisingly familiar places. So I go to the English Premier League and luxury property in New York and London. And then I ask, so what on earth do governments do about what is now an industry that is, roughly more than 500 billion US dollars every year, which is probably bigger than the global illicit drug trade by now? How do we fight this? And then the series ends up back in Kansas, where we find a few more answers and get into the psychology of scamming and why is scamming so effective? How do people fall for scams? And what are the human vulnerabilities that the scammers go after? So scamming looks at the whole multi-billion-dollar sophisticated predatory industry of scamming and how it touches all of us, because the scammers are now coming for every country and all kinds of different people. And what we've just witnessed is actually the biggest shift in modern history in how transnational organized crime works. So we might be familiar with movies like The Godfather, where there's a powerful kingpin and he has a few tattooed gangsters below him, and it's a very hierarchical pyramid. But what we're now seeing is sort of a network, a very loose entrepreneurial network. I sort of think of it as like the gig economy of the underworld, where you might have one small group that specializes in kidnapping people and trafficking them to Myanmar. And then you might have another small group that just focuses on uploading American SIM cards to iPhones that are used inside scam compounds. And then you might have a third group that focuses just on one tiny part of the money laundering puzzle. And that makes it a huge challenge for law enforcement, because how do you go after this industry? It's not as if you can just get the kingpin and shut the whole industry down. This industry is growing really, really quickly, and it's only just getting started in a way.
Yes, and your series is really timely, and I can't compliment you enough. It was well-researched, entertaining. You talk to so many different people who work in the scam compounds. You have emotive conversations with trafficking victims and the people they defrauded. You've got expert commentary from law enforcement, international organizations, and more. But this must have been challenging to put together. Was there anything that you wanted to include in the series that you couldn't?
I mean, there was so much I would have loved to include. Like, I would have loved to find the team that scammed the CEO at the bank. I would have loved to interview the people at the very top of these networks. There's so much that we still don't know about this industry. It's a very tough and dangerous industry to report on. And so there were certain people I couldn't access. But I hope that we've still been able to illuminate quite a bit of the industry that previously wasn't as well known.
Well, it's clear how much hard work went into it, and you even managed to connect a victim of fraud with the victim of human trafficking that committed that fraud, from the scam center, which is remarkable.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that took a lot of work.
Yeah, I bet it did. You've mentioned earlier, when you were giving the overview, that you go into the psychology and the human vulnerabilities that make people susceptible to scams. Because, some people might say, oh, don't trust anyone you meet on the internet. It's very simple. But actually, there's a lot more to it than that. So would you like to comment? You had so many conversations with all these different people involved in Scam Inc. What is the psychology behind scamming someone or falling for a scam?
That's a very good question that I became obsessed with actually when I was making Scam Inc. Um, I wanted to understand, why do people fall for these scams? How do they fall for these scams? I started out on this project thinking I wouldn't be so stupid to fall for a scam. Like that couldn't happen to me. And over the course of my reporting journey, I've completely changed my mind on that because I realized that these criminal syndicates are very sophisticated and deeply understand human psychology, human frailty, human vulnerability, and our weaknesses. And they will identify our weakness, whatever it is, and go after it. So it could be greed or fear or lust or loneliness or even boredom or just being tired at the end of the day and clicking on a link that's actually malware. And once they figure out our weaknesses, they have a whole toolkit of psychological tactics that they use to build trust. So perhaps they might start with love bombing if it's a love scam, and showering you with love. And once trust is built, they might then use a sense of urgency or a sense of fear or anger to force you to do things you actually maybe don't want to do, like put money into a shady crypto investment. And then once you're trying to, get your money out, they might gaslight you. They might question your beliefs. And so all of that is really predatory and very sophisticated. And I think that that's a piece of this puzzle of Scam Inc. that is really worth all of us trying to understand better, to try and also protect ourselves more.
Right. And then thinking about the actual individuals who are doing the scamming. From what I understand, most of those people are coerced or trafficked into these quote unquote jobs or slave-like conditions. The only reason really that we know so much about the industry in Myanmar, for example, is because of human trafficking, allegations, reports, rescues. So what about these people that are actually doing the defrauding? They're one cog in a machine, but there must be some cognitive dissonance going on there.
I would actually just push back on that a little bit because I think based on my reporting, it's not that most people are trafficked in. It's actually a minority of people who are trafficked in. And the majority of people who are low-level scammers are actually there voluntarily. I think that that's perhaps one of the misconceptions about the scam industry, that everyone who is a low-level scammer is a victim of human trafficking, when in fact we're seeing a shift and a lot of people are perhaps entering voluntarily, but then realizing that, it's really a horrific job in a lot of ways. And there's all kinds of torture that the bosses use and coercion that the bosses use. But so I think there's that piece of the puzzle that is increasingly a challenge for law enforcement, because previously law enforcement might have been able to go into a scam compound and rescue a bunch of human trafficking victims to try to shut down the operation. But if people are now inside voluntarily because for all kinds of reasons, there might not be better job opportunities where they are, what does law enforcement do about that? And then I think the other thing is that getting back to the idea of this industry, sometimes what happens is there'll be one team that just starts chatting to people on social media. And once they find a target who they think will invest money, they pass that target on to another team that specializes in going in for the kill, so to speak, and has perfected the psychological tactics to actually have people invest money. So that's also just how sophisticated this industry is, that there's, different groups that specialize in different parts of the actual scam.
Okay, well, thank you for setting me straight there. How did this human trafficking component come into the industry then? It seems like a very, high visibility, risky strategy for an illegal business owner to trick and coerce, international workers across foreign borders, smuggle them across land borders.
So I think what happened initially was it was mainland Chinese criminals scamming mainland Chinese victims, and those criminals would find ways to get sort of low-level scammers to work for them. And often it would be people who perhaps were in gambling debt or in debt in their hometowns, and they would be tricked into entering a scam compound and forced to scam people in China. So I think that was sort of initially what we saw when this was very much a sort of Chinese criminals scamming Chinese victims. Then COVID hit, and it became very difficult for the Chinese criminals to trick people into moving to Southeast Asia because China closed its borders. And so then we saw in countries like the Philippines, Chinese syndicates started kidnapping mainland Chinese people who might have been working for another scam company or might have just been in the Philippines at the time. And then, the whole world was sort of at home on their smartphones. And the criminals realized, oh, we don't have to just scam Chinese people. We can actually scam the whole world. And that was when they realized they needed English speakers. And so we definitely saw a huge wave of human trafficking into the scam compounds, where people from, all kinds of countries, especially in Southeast Asia, were tricked into taking what they thought were customer service jobs in Bangkok, but actually ferried across the border into Myanmar and forced to scam. But I think there's also a lot of people who, come from countries where the average wage every month might be a couple of $100. And the option is, do I remain unemployed or do I toil under the sweltering sun in a field? Or, as someone who's multilingual, university educated, perhaps I can actually just get a job working in a scam compound. I'm not saying that's right, but I do understand why that there is a group of people who fall into that category. Now, I couldn't give you an exact breakdown of, what proportion of people involved in scamming fall into that bucket compared to being victims of human trafficking. But I do think it's important to acknowledge that there are these two different groups of people. And that is a huge challenge for anyone who's trying to fight the rise of the scam industry, because how do you identify the difference between victims of human trafficking and people who might have entered voluntarily? And also, how do you then crack down on this whole industry if there are so many people who, because they feel like they don't have any other job opportunities, are in the scam industry?
Thank you, Sue-Lin. Now, the West, the English-speaking world, has only really started taking this scam industry seriously recently. And many listeners might be surprised to know that this has been reported on in China for years. And in fact, there's a Chinese blockbuster film named No More Bets in English, which depicts a gangster-led scam compound in Southeast Asia. Frontier Myanmar actually held a screening for this film for its members in Chiang Mai last year. I wonder, could the English-speaking world learn a little bit from how the Chinese public has responded to Scam Inc.?
Well, so I think the thing to know about the origins of Scam Inc. are that, in a way, the Chinese criminal syndicates that are now targeting the whole world really honed their techniques on mainland Chinese victims. And I actually remember being in China in 2015 or so, and this was already a huge topic of conversation. It was mostly focused on telecoms fraud rather than online scams that were happening on social media and apps. But I think there's a lot more awareness in China about Scam Inc. and online scams because the criminals have been targeting mainland Chinese victims for many, many years. I would argue there's actually no country that better understands the scale and sophistication of these criminal syndicates than China. And there's a whole genre of Chinese films, Chinese TV shows, Chinese songs that are really focused on the industry of scamming and sort of get at it from different angles and look at the costs and look at the different victims. So No More Bets would be the very famous blockbuster, which is really worth a watch if you haven't already. But my personal favorite in the genre is a much slower art house movie called Tainted Love, which explores like the very complicated relationships between the victim of a scam and her scammers.
Oh, terrific. I haven't seen that. I'll have to get the Chinese name from you when we're done recording. Staying on China, but shifting a little bit. In your podcast series, you address the supposed link between scam centers, Chinese-led scam centers, and the Chinese state or the Chinese Communist Party. As we go up the chain of accountability and authority in these scam centers, there's all this evasion. What I mean is the people who confiscate and then lease out the land on the ground in Myanmar, they say they've got nothing to do with what happens inside. They're just leasing the land to a company. And then that company will say in turn, oh, we just sublease buildings and offices to legitimate businesses. We don't know what happens inside. You keep going up the chain and so on and so forth. And at the top, the very development of these compounds, it's aligned by tycoons with the Belt and Road Initiative, a Chinese-led investment scheme. And there are also reports that trafficked workers, before they start work in the compounds, they recite pro-China slogans. So my question here is there a connection, provable, between these scam compounds and the Chinese state or the Communist Party? Or is it merely bottom-up? Is it merely aspirational and just used by criminals sort of for cover?
I think your hypothesis that this is very bottom-up and the criminals find it useful to try to align themselves with the Chinese Communist Party is spot on. And again, I think it's helpful to look at the history here. Over the past 3 years, the Chinese Communist Party has arrested more than 800,000 Chinese nationals connected to online scams. Millions of Chinese file police reports every single year after being scammed. So this is a huge domestic problem for the Chinese Communist Party. And in fact, the reason why we now see these scam syndicates across Southeast Asia and increasingly around the world is because the Chinese Communist Party kicked them out of China because they were so fed up with them. So I think that's all really important background to understand what we're seeing now. And I think there's been quite a bit of not very good reporting in the West trying to say that the Chinese Communist Party is somehow behind the scam industry, which is something that I decided to look into when I was making Scam Inc. But I found no evidence of this at all. And every time this comes up, I like to ask people, like, what hard evidence do you actually have, given almost 1 million people have been arrested by the Chinese Communist Party connected to scams, etc. That having been said, I think, having covered China for many years, the reality is that Chinese businessmen know the rational decision for them is to align themselves with the Chinese Communist Party and use slogans that are used by the Chinese Communist Party, like Belt and Road, because that's just good business if you're a mainland Chinese person to show loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party. So we absolutely see the criminals say, oh, yes, this is a part of the Belt and Road project. But I think that is used by all kinds of different people from mainland China, whether they're scam bosses or they're sort of smaller time factory owners exporting bicycle parts. Everyone will try to jump on the slogan of the day, given the political structure inside China. So then there's another question, which is the Chinese Communist Party doing everything it possibly can to stop criminals in Myanmar or Thailand or Cambodia or the Philippines from scamming Americans? Probably not. I just think that when Xi Jinping and other top members of the Chinese Communist Party wake up every morning, the number one priority on their list is probably not, oh, how do we go after Chinese criminals around the world who are trying to scam Westerners. I can't imagine is a top priority for the Chinese Communist Party, especially given the geopolitical environment right now and tensions between China and the West. It doesn't seem rational to me that the Chinese leadership would invest a huge amount of resources trying to stop the criminals from targeting Westerners.
Okay, and on that note of, these two global superpowers, China and the United States, don't you think that, tackling these scam centers or talking about tackling these scam centers together, doesn't that kind of look like low-hanging fruit for cooperation between China and the US? They're struggling to find this kind of low-hanging fruit. But instead, China has been doing all the heavy lifting on scam centers in the region, and Western interest is comparatively recent in the media and still little action coming out of it. Do you agree with me? Is this a good opportunity for cooperation?
Yeah, so I definitely agree with you that more cooperation would be great, or at least I think an acknowledgement that China's been grappling with this issue for many years and really does understand a lot of how it works in ways that a lot of other governments do not. That having been said, I just think realistically, given the political environment, it's hard for me to imagine that there would be a lot of cooperation between China and, say, the West. Even though, in theory, I think there should be. I just think in practice, for all kinds of reasons, that might be challenging. That having been said, if you look at what's happening between China and Myanmar, China and Thailand, China and Cambodia, the Chinese Communist Party is trying to work with governments that it shares a border with to clamp down on scams. So I think the situation is quite different when you look at mainland Southeast Asia and governments in that region trying to deal with the growing scam problem and the extent to which their local police forces might be working with Chinese police to raid scam compounds, for example.
Okay, Sue-Lin, very quick last question. Pressure is increasing on these centers in Myanmar, as I spoke about earlier in this podcast. But it remains to be seen if this pressure will be constant enough to affect real change and actually negatively impact these scam centers in Myanmar. This is because, there are just so many. They're spread out across so many different sovereign and rebel territories. And when one goes down, it's a little bit like whack-a-mole. They just appear somewhere else. As we know, you talked about the history with China, but a lot of the scam compounds that appeared in Myanmar actually came from Cambodia first. So they very well could have come from China to Cambodia to Myanmar. They're very mobile. In this context, do you think that the scam industry is here to stay? Is this just going to be part of life in the 21st century?
I think so, sadly. That would be the conclusion of my reporting, that Scam Inc. has just gotten started. And given the criminals are making hundreds of billions of dollars every year, they have so much money to reinvest in their businesses, to buy the latest AI and technology, and to pay off political elites and business elites in countries where corruption is a serious problem. And that's, many countries in Southeast Asia. And, in Myanmar, which is kind of exceptional given the civil war, the criminal syndicates obviously pay off various different rebel groups and ethnic militia, and it's even more complicated picture in Myanmar. And what we're also seeing is it's not just that these criminal syndicates are based in Southeast Asia anymore; they're expanding globally. And so there's been reports of scam compounds found in Peru, in Dubai, in Georgia, in Ghana. There was a report last year that one was even found on the Isle of Man between England and Ireland. So this is now becoming a global problem. And as we see the rise of AI and face-changing software, voice cloning software, really much more sophisticated information stealers, I worry that Scam Inc. is evolving away from pig butchering scams to very personalized, targeted scams using sort of the swirls of data that we all have now online. And all of this is a huge challenge for law enforcement, which is really struggling to keep up with the criminals.
Thank you, Sue-Lin, for that sobering assessment. Again, listeners, you can find the new series from The Economist, Scam Inc., on any podcast player. Just type in scam space INC dot, and I'm sure it will come up quickly. So once again, thanks so much for coming on the show, Sue-Lin.
Thanks so much for having me, Luke.
And another thank you to all of our listeners. If you enjoyed the interview with Sue-Lin or you have any feedback on the show overall, please just get in touch. You can email whimyanmar@proton.me. And don't forget to enjoy all the other content by Frontier Myanmar this week, including daily briefings, translated articles, and the Political Insider newsletter. This past Sunday, Douglas Long and MK published an in-depth look for Frontier members at electricity generation and supply in the country. And now it's time to say farewell and take care.